There is a sound you don't expect to hear inside a California state prison. It isn't silence. It isn't the clang of metal doors or the echo of boots on concrete. It is the soft and certain whimper of a puppy meeting the world for the very first time. And the hands holding that puppy belong to a man serving time for a crime that changed his life forever. Before we go further, if stories like this one move you, stay with us, subscribe, share this with someone who needs to see it, leave a comment below. These stories only reach the people who need them when you help carry them forward. California's prison system holds one of the largest incarcerated populations on Earth. At its peak, the system was so overcrowded the Supreme Court called it unconstitutional. Cells designed for one man held two. Gymnasiums became sleeping quarters. Medical care collapsed under the weight of numbers no system was designed to absorb. For decades, the conversation around American incarceration stayed fixed on punishment, on containment, on time served, and sentences handed down in courtrooms far from these walls. But somewhere inside that bruised, complicated system, a quieter argument was forming. Not in a courtroom, not in a legislative chamber. In a kennel, in a prison yard, in the trembling space between a man's scarred hands and a dog that did not yet know what fear was. The Prison Policy Initiative estimates that 96% of incarcerated people will one day return to our communities. That number carries enormous weight when you sit with it long enough. It means the question was never simply about punishment. It was always also about who walks out those gates and what they carry with them when they do. California's corrections system began asking that question more seriously in recent years. The answers they explored were sometimes controversial, sometimes quietly radical. One answer came in the form of a program that placed puppies, future service dogs, into the care of inmates at select facilities across the state. The program was not born from sentimentality. It was built on research, on recidivism data, on a calculated bet that responsibility and attachment could do what punishment alone had failed to do. But programs like this do not exist in a vacuum. They exist inside institutions with long memories and deep contradictions. They exist alongside officers who have seen programs come and go, alongside inmates who have learned not to trust what the system offers, alongside administrators balancing budgets, liability, and public perception all at once. The puppy arrives innocent into all of that complexity. And what happens next to the dog, to the man, to the fragile hope this program is built on is a story that California has not fully told. Not yet. This is a story about second chances, yes. But it is also a story about what second chances cost. About what it takes to build something gentle inside a place designed to be hard. About men who are asked to give love freely to an animal they will one day have to surrender. About whether any of that surrender ultimately means anything at all. The fluorescent lights in California's prisons do not flicker romantically. They hum, constant, institutional, indifferent. Under those lights, something quietly extraordinary has been trying to survive. We are going to find out if it has. The program has a name that sounds almost too soft for where it lives. Depending on the facility, it operates under titles like Pups on Parole, or Tender Loving Canines, or simply the Dog Program. The names change. The architecture of hope inside them stays largely the same. A dog arrives at roughly 8 weeks old, young enough to be shaped, young enough to need everything. The inmate assigned to that dog becomes, in the language of the program, its primary handler. That word handler adds a lot of work inside these walls. It implies control. It implies authority. It implies a relationship governed by clear professional distance. What it does not prepare anyone for is what actually happens between a man and a dog over months of shared living. The selection process for handlers is not casual. Program coordinators review disciplinary records. They conduct interviews. They look for inmates who demonstrate what one coordinator described in reporting as emotional stability and genuine motivation. That phrase, a genuine motivation, sits in an interesting place inside a prison. Motivation is a currency inside these facilities. Inmates learn quickly what the institution rewards and what it punishes. The question that lingers is how you measure sincerity in a place where performing sincerity can reduce your sentence. Program staff say they can tell the difference. Inmates who have been through the program say the difference reveals itself in the dog's behavior more than in anything a man claims about himself. A dog does not respond to performance. A dog responds to presence, to steadiness, to the quality of attention a person brings to a quiet room. Inside the training sessions, the work is methodical and surprisingly technical. Handlers learn commands. Yes, sit, stay. He'll come, but service dog training runs far deeper than basic obedience. These animals are being prepared to support people with mobility challenges, PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, autism spectrum conditions. The precision required is significant. The patience required is something else entirely. Inmates are taught how to socialize the dogs to environments they will later work in: hospitals, airports, shopping centers, crowded public spaces. Inside a facility where movement is controlled and the world beyond the fence is largely theoretical, this creates an unusual challenge. You are preparing an animal for a freedom neither of you currently possesses. Former handlers who have spoken to journalists describe the early weeks as disorienting. One man, incarcerated for over a decade, described the first night with his assigned puppy as the first time in years something needed him in a way that had nothing to do with survival. That distinction matters more than it might appear from the outside. Prison relationships are often transactional by necessity. Trust is rationed. Vulnerability is a liability. A puppy does not negotiate any of that. It simply arrives, frightened and warm, and chooses you because you are there. Several former handlers have used near identical language when describing that first night. They talk about the weight of the dog against their chest or leg as something that reorganized something inside them. They struggle to name it precisely. The word they most often reach for is responsibility, not the institutional kind, assigned by paperwork and schedule. Something older, simpler, more frightening in its clarity. The training curriculum typically runs 6 to 18 months depending on the facility and the dog's specific service track. During that time, the handler and dog are rarely separated during waking hours. They eat in proximity. They exercise together. The dog sleeps in the cell. Officers and staff who have worked alongside these programs describe a visible change in the atmosphere of units where the dogs are present. Not a transformation, not a miracle, a measurable, documentable shift in tension levels, in the frequency of certain kinds of incidents. One officer, speaking carefully, noted that it was difficult to maintain a certain kind of hardness around an animal that had no understanding of what hardness was for. That observation did not make it into any official report, but it is the kind of detail that lives in the spaces between the documented facts, and it is in those spaces between the official program materials and the lived reality where this story begins to complicate itself. Because California's prison system is vast and inconsistent, what works in one facility does not automatically transfer to another. What is celebrated in a press release does not always survive contact with daily institutional reality. The program, by most measures available, shows genuine promise. The data on handler behavior during participation is largely encouraging, but data has edges. And at the edges of this program, there are questions the official narrative has not yet fully answered. Questions about what happens to the men when the dogs leave. Questions about whether the transformation the program promises is real, durable, or something more fragile than anyone in administration wants to acknowledge. Those questions are where we are heading next. There is a moment in every handler's experience that the program brochures do not photograph. It comes not during training, not during the proud milestones when a dog masters a new command. It comes the day the dog leaves. Program coordinators call it graduation. The dog completes its training, passes its certification assessments, and is transferred to the organization that will place it with its permanent recipient. The handler stands in a room, or a yard, or a corridor, and watches the animal walk away. And then, they return to a cell that is suddenly, completely, and bearably quiet. Several former handlers have spoken publicly about this moment. Their accounts share a consistency that is difficult to dismiss as performance or exaggeration. One man described standing at the door of his cell for an extended period, unable to identify what he was feeling, before recognizing it as grief. Not grief in the abstract, specific, Physical. Disorienting grief. The kind that locates itself in the body before the mind catches up. He had been incarcerated for 11 years at that point. He said the dog's departure was the hardest thing he had experienced since his arrest. He paused when a journalist asked him to explain that. Then he said, "Because this time, the loss was clean. There was no one to blame. Nothing went wrong. It was just over." Program administrators are aware of this emotional reality. Most facilities offer some form of follow-up support for handlers after a dog's departure. Group sessions, one-on-one check-ins, the option to begin the process again with a new animal. The re-enrollment rate among eligible handlers is notably high, which raises a question the program's own supporters sometimes ask quietly among themselves. Is re-enrollment a sign of the program's success, men so transformed by the experience they seek to repeat it? Or is it something more complicated? Is the program, in some cases, creating a cycle of attachment and loss that the institution is not fully equipped to support? Inside California's corrections infrastructure, mental health resources are unevenly distributed. Some facilities have robust programming. Others operate with chronic staff shortages and waitlists for basic therapeutic services. The dog program exists inside that same uneven landscape. Its emotional demands are real and documented. Its support infrastructure varies significantly depending on where you are serving your time and who is running the unit that week. Former participants who struggled after a dog's departure described reaching for support and finding inconsistency. Some found counselors who understood the program's emotional architecture and could work within it. Others were told, in various ways, to manage their feelings and move forward. That instruction to manage and move forward is not unique to California's prisons, but inside an institution where emotional management is already a survival skill rather than a therapeutic goal, it lands differently. There is also a harder question embedded in this program that researchers and advocates have begun to raise. The service dogs trained inside these facilities go on to serve people with profound and genuine needs: veterans living with PTSD, children navigating autism, adults rebuilding independence after catastrophic injury. The dogs are extraordinarily well trained. The outcomes for recipients are, by available evidence, genuinely positive. But the men who train those animals will not attend the placement ceremonies. They will not meet the person their work ultimately served. They will not receive a photograph or a letter or a moment of acknowledgement from the world beyond the fence. The transaction is entirely one-directional. The handler gives, the institution facilitates, the world outside receives. And the man returns to his cell with nothing material to show for months of disciplined, skilled, emotionally demanding work. Whether that invisibility is an acceptable cost or an institutional failure depends entirely on who you ask. And then there are the cases that fall further outside the program's official narrative, incidents that did not make press releases. Handlers who were removed from the program mid-cycle due to disciplinary infractions, sometimes minor, sometimes significant. Dogs reassigned suddenly, without the gradual transition that program guidelines recommend. Men who invested months of genuine effort into an animal, only to have that animal removed overnight following an unrelated institutional incident. The program's official documentation does not dwell on these cases. The men involved have largely not spoken publicly, but the accounts that do exist, gathered quietly in visiting rooms and through legal correspondence, describe something. The official program narrative has no language for. They describe what happens when the one thing a man was trusted to care for is taken from him without ceremony, without explanation, without the clean grief of graduation. Just absence. Where something living used to be. We reached out to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation for comment on HANDLER support protocols and program interruption procedures. We are still waiting for a full response. That silence, institutional, procedural, familiar, may itself be part of the story, because the question this program ultimately forces into the open is not simply whether it works. The question is, works for whom? The dogs graduate, the recipients benefit. The program generates positive coverage, But inside those cells, in the units where the fluorescent lights hum their indifferent hum, the men who made all of that possible are still there, waiting, hoping, grieving quietly. And somewhere in California right now, a handler is sleeping beside a dog he knows he will one day have to let go. He knows it. He chose it anyway. What that choice costs him and what the system owes him in return is a question California has not yet fully answered. If this story is striking something in you, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what we uncovered in the next chapter changes the texture of everything we have told you so far. Asterisk, to understand what this program is really asking of these men, you have to understand what most of them were before they arrived. Not the crime, not the sentence, the life that preceded both. Research into the backgrounds of incarcerated populations in California reveals patterns that are not surprising to anyone who works inside the system. High rates of childhood trauma, disrupted attachment, homes where consistency was scarce and safety was negotiable. A significant percentage of people currently incarcerated in California experienced what researchers call adverse childhood experiences, events that alter the developing brain's relationship to trust, to connection, to the very concept of permanence. You do not need to sentimentalize that fact to take it seriously. It simply means that for many of the men in this program, the dog may be the first relationship in their lives built entirely on reliable, unconditional response. Attachment theory, developed across decades of psychological research, identifies early bonding experiences as foundational to how human beings relate to the world. When those early experiences are fractured by absent parents, neglect, abuse, instability, and effects do not disappear with age. They reorganize. They go underground. They surface in behaviors that the criminal justice system tends to punish rather than trace. What the dog program does, whether or not it uses this language, is create a structured opportunity for reattachment, a chance to practice, under supervision, what consistent caregiving feels like from the giving side. Several researchers studying prison animal programs have noted that the physiological effects are measurable. Cortisol levels, the hormone most associated with chronic stress, decrease in inmates who participate in animal-assisted programs. Oxytocin levels, associated with bonding and trust, increase. The body responds to the dog before the mind has finished deciding whether to allow it. Inside the facilities where the program runs, staff describe behavioral changes that track with this research. Men who entered the program with long disciplinary histories show measurably fewer infractions during their participation. The effect is not universal. The program is not a guarantee of anything, but the consistency of the pattern across multiple facilities over multiple years is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. What is harder to measure, and what the data does not yet fully capture, is what happens to that pattern after the dog leaves. Some former handlers maintain the behavioral improvements long after their participation ends. Others show a regression that program staff describe carefully in the language of institutional documentation as a return to baseline. That phrase, return to baseline, is doing significant work in those reports. Baseline, in this context, means the coping strategies a man developed before the program gave him different ones. There is a handler named Marcus, whose story has been shared in limited form by journalists covering California's rehabilitation programs. His full name has not been published, and we will not speculate beyond what has been reported. What is documented is this: Marcus entered the dog program after more than 8 years of incarceration, with a disciplinary record that program coordinators describe as significant. He was, by his own account and the account of staff who worked with him, not an obvious candidate. He was accepted after a second application. The dog assigned to him was a yellow Labrador named for a virtue. The programs often name their dogs this way. Over 14 months, Marcus and that dog became what staff described as one of the strongest handler partnerships the facility had seen. The dog's training outcomes were exceptional. The behavioral assessments were among the highest recorded in that program cycle. When the dog graduated, Marcus did not apply for a new assignment immediately. He sat with the absence for 3 months. Then he applied. Again, He is currently on his third dog. His case is held up by program advocates as evidence of the program's deepest potential. Not the dog's successful placement, not the recipient's improved quality of life, but the man who kept returning, who chose, repeatedly and with full knowledge of the cost, to love something he would have to release. Psychologists who study post-traumatic growth describe this kind of chosen vulnerability as one of the most significant indicators of genuine behavioral change. It is the opposite of the defensive detachment that chronic trauma produces. It is, in the plainest terms, someone learning to trust the process of caring even when caring guarantees loss. But Marcus's story exists alongside other stories that program administrators are less eager to discuss. Men who completed the program, showed every indicator of change, and still returned to prison within years of release. Not because the program failed them in any simple or attributable way, but because the world they returned to had not changed while they were inside learning how to. The neighborhood, the economic reality, the absence of support structures, the presence of old networks with long memories. The dog program can teach a man to regulate his nervous system in a controlled institutional environment. It cannot rebuild the infrastructure of a life on the outside, and California's reentry support systems, housing assistance, employment pathways, mental health continuity remain, by most assessments, insufficient to meet the scale of the need. This is where the program's genuine promise meets the system's genuine limitations, not in bad faith, not in malicious design. In the gap between what a well-designed program can accomplish inside a prison and what a chronically underfunded reentry infrastructure can sustain outside one. The dog teaches the man something real. The question is whether California is prepared to honor that lesson with anything more than a bus ticket and a modest gate allowance on the day of release. The answer, based on available evidence and the accounts of those who have lived it, is complicated. And complication, in a system this large and this consequential, tends to fall heaviest on the people with the least capacity to absorb it. The dogs do not know any of this. That fact is worth sitting with for a moment before we continue. The Labrador sleeping in a prison cell does not understand incarceration. It does not understand recidivism statistics or reentry policy or the gap between rehabilitation rhetoric and institutional reality. It understands the person in front of it. The consistency of their voice, the steadiness of their hands, whether they show up the same way today as they did yesterday. In that sense, the dog is the most honest evaluator in the entire system. It cannot be impressed by paperwork. It cannot be misled by performance and what it reflects back in its behavior. Its responsiveness, its willingness to trust is a kind of truth that institutional assessment tools have never quite managed to replicate. Program trainers who have worked with both professional service dog organizations and prison-based programs consistently note something that surprises outside observers. The dogs trained inside correctional facilities frequently perform at exceptionally high levels. Not despite their environment, not in spite of the limitations of where they were trained. In some documented cases, because of the intensity and consistency of the attention they received there, a handler with nowhere else to be, no other responsibilities competing for his focus, no commute or phone or fractured schedule, that handler can offer a quality of sustained attention that is genuinely difficult to replicate in a traditional training environment. The irony is not lost on anyone who thinks about it carefully. An institution designed to remove a man from society has, in some measurable sense, created conditions where he can become extraordinarily good at preparing another living thing for that same society. The organizations that receive these dogs know this. Canine Companions, one of the largest service dog organizations in the United States, has worked with prison training programs for decades. Their placement officers speak carefully but clearly about the quality of animals coming out of correctional facilities. They describe dogs that are unusually settled and usually attentive to human emotional states and usually capable of maintaining calm in high-stress environments. Those qualities do not appear by accident. They are the product of months of patient, consistent, emotionally invested work by men who had every reason to be hard and chose Inside this program, to be something else. There are currently hundreds of active prison-based dog training programs operating across the United States. California's programs represent some of the longest-running and most studied examples. The research literature on these programs, while still developing, trends consistently in one direction. Participants show reduced disciplinary infractions, reduced anxiety measures, improved social functioning within the facility. Victim advocacy groups have engaged with this research from varying positions. Some express concern that programs perceived as rehabilitative create public narratives that minimize the reality of harm caused by the people participating in them. That concern deserves honest acknowledgement rather than dismissal. The existence of a program that produces genuine change does not retroactively resolve the harm that preceded it. Both things are true simultaneously, and the people most affected by that tension are not the administrators or the researchers. They are the victims and their families who watch from outside the conversation. Inside the facilities, there is a culture that has developed around the program that nobody fully designed. Inmates who are not handlers watch the program from a distance, some with skepticism, some with quiet interest, some with something closer to longing. The presence of the dogs changes the social atmosphere of a unit in ways that extend beyond the handlers themselves. Officers have described moments where dogs' simple passage through a common area visibly altered the emotional temperature of the space. Not dramatically, not in ways that belong in a press release. In the small, human ways that matter most, in environments where small human moments are the only ones available. A dog pausing to accept a scratch behind the ear from an inmate who is not its handler. A brief and scheduled moment of softness in a place engineered for hardness. Those moments do not appear in outcome data, but the people who witness them remember them with a precision that suggests they carry weight. We spoke through correspondence with a man who completed the program at a Northern California facility 3 years ago and was released 14 months back. He asked that we not use his name. He is currently employed. He is living in supervised transitional housing. He described his time as a handler as the period when he first understood that he was capable of being responsible for something that mattered. Not responsible in the legal sense. He understood that version of responsibility already, in the most painful way possible. Responsible in the sense of being the reason something thrived. He said the dog never knew his case number, never knew his sentence length, never knew what he had done. It knew his voice, his schedule, the particular way he sat when he was anxious, and it stayed anyway. He said he thinks about that dog every day. He said he is not sure he would have survived re-entry without what that animal taught him. Then he paused, in the way that people pause when they have said something more true than they intended, and he said he hopes the dog is okay. There is something in that hope that sits at the very center of what this program is and what it is trying to do. Not the data, not the recidivism statistics, not the policy arguments. The simple, exposed, entirely human act of hoping that something you loved is somewhere out there, living well. That capacity to care about something beyond yourself, beyond your immediate survival, beyond the walls of the institution that holds you is precisely what chronic trauma and long incarceration work to destroy. The fact that it survives here, in some men, through some dogs, in some facilities, is not a small thing. It is, depending on how seriously you take the science of human change, one of the most significant things the California prison system is currently producing. The question that remains, that has always remained, is whether the system knows that. Whether it is prepared to protect it, resource it, and build on it with the seriousness it deserves, or whether it will continue to treat it as a program, a feature, a press opportunity, something to point to when the harder questions come. Asterisk. There is a question that surfaces at the end of every serious examination of prison rehabilitation programs. It is not a comfortable question. It does not resolve cleanly into policy language or program metrics. It is this: what do we actually believe about human beings? Not in the abstract, not in the language of mission statements or legislative preambles. In practice, in funding decisions, in the design of the systems we build to respond to harm. Do we believe that people change? And if we do, if the evidence compels us toward that belief, what does that belief obligate us to do? California's prison dog program does not answer that question. Nothing so small could. But it poses the question with unusual clarity. Because it takes men that the system has formally defined by their worst moment and asks them to demonstrate their best capacity. And in a significant number of documented cases, they do. They demonstrate patience, precision, emotional regulation, consistent caregiving. They demonstrate, in the language of behavioral science, exactly the qualities that research identifies as predictive of successful reintegration. And then the system largely returns them to the conditions that made those qualities so difficult to develop in the first place. The 96% figure from the Prison Policy Initiative is worth returning to. Here, 96% of incarcerated people will one day return to their communities. Not to an abstract community, to a specific street, a specific neighborhood, specific relationships and pressures and histories. The DOG program reaches a fraction of that population, even within the facilities where it operates. Not every eligible inmate participates. Resources are limited. Spaces are limited. The organizations that supply the dogs have their own capacity constraints. What the program currently represents is a proof of concept. Evidence, carefully gathered across decades of operation, that this approach to rehabilitation is worth taking seriously. The question is whether California, whether any system is prepared to take it seriously, at the scale the need actually demands. The men who have moved through this program and out into the world carry something with them that is difficult to quantify. Not a certificate, not a job skill in the traditional sense, though some have gone on to work in veterinary settings, animal shelters, and professional training environments. Something more internal than that, a reorganized understanding of what they are capable of, a memory, physical, embodied, cellular, of what it felt like to be trusted with, something living, of what it felt like to be the reason something thrived. Researchers who study identity transformation in formerly incarcerated people talk about the importance of what they call a redemption narrative, not a story told to a parole board, not performance, a genuine internal account of who a person is becoming, grounded in real experience and real evidence. The dog provides that evidence, not symbolically, literally. Here is the animal. Here is its behavior. Here is what your consistency, your patience, your care produced. That is not nothing. In the architecture of human change, that is close to everything. There are handlers who have been released and relapsed, who return to prison and, in some cases, to the program. Their existence does not invalidate the program's value. It confirms the complexity of what the program is working against. Decades of trauma do not dissolve in 14 months of dog training. Poverty does not resolve because a man learned to regulate his nervous system. The absence of affordable housing does not fill itself because a Labrador once trusted someone enough to sleep beside him. The program is one intervention inside a system of interlocking failures that no single program was designed to address. Holding it responsible for those failures is a way of avoiding the harder conversation about what else needs to change. The harder conversation is about investment. About whether California is prepared to fund reentry infrastructure, anything approaching the scale of the incarceration infrastructure it maintains. About whether mental health continuity, transitional housing, employment support, and community reintegration services receive the sustained political attention that prison construction has historically received. The DOG program costs relatively little. The research suggests it returns significant value in reduced incidence, reduced recidivism among participants, improved institutional climate, and highly trained service animals placed with people who genuinely need them. It is, by almost any available measure, one of the more efficient uses of correctional resources currently operating in the state, and yet it reaches a fraction of those who could benefit. And yet the men who complete it return to a reentry system that frequently cannot meet them where their growth has taken them. Somewhere in California tonight, a man is lying in a prison cell with a dog sleeping against his legs. He knows, with a certainty that has become familiar, that this will end. that there will be a morning when the dog is loaded into a vehicle and driven toward a life he will never see. He knows this and he chooses it anyway. He chooses to show up tomorrow with the same patience he showed up with today. He chooses to trust that what he is building in this animal will matter to someone, somewhere, in ways he will never be permitted to witness. That choice made quietly, without audience, without reward, inside an institution designed to diminish the capacity for exactly that kind of choice, is one of the most profound acts of human resilience this system currently contains. It deserves more than a press release. It deserves more than a program that reaches a fraction of those who need it. It deserves a system genuinely organized around the belief that the people inside it are worth the investment of serious, sustained, honest care. Whether California gets there, whether any system gets there, remains, as of this moment, an open question. The dogs graduate, the handlers remain, and somewhere between those two facts lives everything the story has been trying to say. This documentary was built from real reporting, real research, and the real accounts of people who lived this experience. If it stayed with you, if it changed something in how you think about incarceration, about rehabilitation, about what human beings are capable of, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you are here for the next story. Leave a comment below. Tell us what this raised for you. Those conversations matter more than you might think. We will keep making documentaries like this one as long as you keep watching them. Thank you for staying until the end.